All right. Trusting the Call of God, Part 2. Back to Gideon. Great to be together. I decided I would take off on a Corbin's fashion sense here. This has two advantages. One, I got the Van Gogh socks because my wife knows I like Van Gogh. And two, a year from now, when somebody watches this series online, they will say to themselves, why in the world does that guy have socks in his pocket? So, they have that to look forward to. I thought I would, as a nod to Father's Day, most of the fathers probably have something like this in their house, right? Either a shirt or a cup or something that proclaims them the world's best dad. Now, objectively, it's not possible for all of us to be the world's best dad, I realize. But the important thing is you have somebody that thinks you are, and so that's great. But I just wanted to thank fathers. We're talking about the calling of God, and being a father is certainly a demanding calling. I have somewhere in my drawer, I have a shirt that says, fatherhood is the toughest job you'll ever love. And I think that's true. But I also wanted to recognize there's a lot of people in this room that are fathers to people that need father figures in their life. Either they didn't know their father or they had a rough relationship with their father, and they need the love and guidance and support of great men that can be a father to them and provide, advice and counsel and cheesy jokes that you need to become a functioning adult. And so we appreciate those people that invest in people that maybe they're not a biological father to, but they provide great love and support to many. So thank you. Okay, this verse in James, which we've looked at many times, James says when talking about faith, which we know from our series is tied to trust, he says, show me your faith without deeds, and I will show you my faith by what I do. This idea of a calling, like the idea of faith and trust, is something that sometimes in our thinking gets de-linked from action. But really, the call of God has to get down to action sooner or later. It has to get down to things that we do and putting it into practice. And so that's the part of the story we're dealing with primarily today with Gideon. So, Gideon's actions prove that he trusted the call of God because he acted on what God told him to do. I wanted to say a word about looking at Old Testament stories and applying them to events in our time. Sometimes we struggle with the stories we look at in the Old Testament because for example, the one we're looking at today involves war and invasion and repelling an invasion. Those things are not always things that we relate to personally and certainly don't want to relate to personally. But they still teach us great lessons about faith and obeying God. And even in the first century, Christians really weren't involved anymore in those kind of actions, and yet they still learned lessons from the Old Testament. And so we certainly want to do that as well. It's really the faith that's being exercised that we're looking at in this story. So Gideon is called to go and save Israel in the strength he has. So we're going to look at him making preparations to save Israel. We're going to look at the idea of enough is enough. I don't know, we usually think we don't have enough, but God has his idea of what enough is, and so we're going to explore that a little bit. We're going to look at an odd thing that happens in this story, and that is him getting encouragement from the enemy. Not the place you would usually expect to get that. And we're going to look at the idea of a spark turning into a fire. And then lastly, we're going to talk again about what we can learn. So let's jump in. So Gideon has to prepare to save Israel. Remember in Judges 6:14, the Lord said to turn to him and said, go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. So that's why save Israel is in quote marks, is because that's what God told Gideon to do. And that's a tall order. But that's the situation he finds himself in. So in verse 35 of chapter 6, Gideon calls up the fighting men as he prepares to go and do this saving Israel thing. And so he calls this group up. Now, we saw this map last week. If you read back in 635, he calls people up from all over Manasseh. He calls people up from Zebulun, Asher, and Naphtali. And so he calls out fighting men from all of these places. The Midianites are camped in the area around where Issachar is, so maybe that's why he didn't call them. But they're all around there. And so he calls up all of these people to come and fight. Let's talk a little bit about the math that we're dealing with here. The Midianites are described as an uncountable swarm of locusts in chapter 6, verse 5, and that comes up again in chapter 7, we'll read later. We don't know exactly how many there were, but there are a lot of them. In chapter 8, verse 10, just in numbering their casualties, it says there were 120,000 swordsmen that were killed from the Midianite army, and there were 15,000 remaining. So we're up to 135,000, even without taking anybody else into account. It's a big number. That's the point. That's who they're up against. Gideon, and you'll see how we get to this number later, Gideon, when he calls these guys out for battle, only has 32,000 guys. Okay, so we're 32,000 against probably 150,000 or more. Those are not good odds. I mean, do you want to go to battle against a group of that many with that kind of ratio? Anybody ever play the board games, where you attack armies and try to take over the world? The game Risk. I love the game Risk. There's math involved in that. You only attack when you have numerical advantage. If you try to attack, my son, when he was young, my son, he was an aggressive Risk player as a youth. He would attack you with 4 guys and you had 25. And, you lose that way. He learned that lesson. Now he probably would beat me in Risk, especially because he's good at math. But that's a losing strategy to attack somebody with superior numbers when you have a small group. And yet that's the situation Gideon finds himself in. They're actually camping out near where the Midianite army is. So they're close by. It's one thing for you to look at the slide or hear me talk about numbers and get somebody to give you a ratio of what the troop size is. It's an entirely other thing when you're camped near them and you can look around and see your guys and look down there and see their guys and realize we're in big trouble because there's a lot more of them than there are of us. But that's the situation the Israelites were in. The ones that answered were the brave ones. Okay? This call goes out for, when we're talking about Gideon's group, we're talking about the ones that responded to the call. They're the ones that answered. So, they're the ones that are the most willing to go. So that's who he's gathered to save Israel. So, there he is, and we will pick up in chapter 7. Early in the morning, Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all his men camped at the spring of Harod. The camp of Midian was north of them in the valley near the hill of Moreh. The Lord said to Gideon, "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me." Imagine you're in Gideon's situation and you're looking there and you're looking at the camp and you're looking at who you've got and who they've got, and you say, man, we're in trouble. And God comes to you with a message and it's like, oh, good, he's going to give me more guys. And God's message is, no, you have too many. Oh, wow, okay. So then God tells him how to get more closer to the right number. He says, you've got too many, I can't deliver them. In verse 3, now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. So 22,000 men left, while 10,000 remained. Okay, so now you know how we get to the 32,000 number. If anybody's ever been around guys who are going into a conflict situation, it's a high adrenaline environment. You never want to admit in that circumstance that you're afraid. And so, Gideon comes out and announces to the troop, if you tremble with fear, you can go home. 22,000 of them leave. Now, I don't know if they left all at once or if 5,000 left and then, some others saw them leave and said, well, I'm going too. And eventually somebody said, everybody's leaving. I'm getting out of here. Over 2/3 of his group leaves. Wow. That's intimidating. But that's the situation he's in. So, Gideon obviously is trying to gather himself, but he's still got 10,000 guys, okay? That's still a pretty substantial number. God comes back. Let's read on. But the Lord said to Gideon, there are still too many men. Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. Gee, thanks, God. I had read this many times, but I had never picked up on this language, that I will thin out the group for you. Whatever Gideon wanted from God in this situation, I guarantee you it wasn't he wanted him to thin out the group more. But that's what God says. So he says, take him down to the water and I'll thin the group out for you. So here's the test that God gives him. Now this picture was the best one I could find, and it shows the basic action. But you have to think about this for a minute. He's taking a group of 10,000 people to the water to drink. I mean, that's a basketball arena full of people. It's a bunch. And so 10,000 of them, he tells these 10,000 people, go drink water. And God says, okay, here's the ones I want you to pick out. The ones that drink water by putting their hand down in the water and bringing it up to their mouth, keep them. The ones that bend over and drink like a dog out of the stream, send them home. 3% of the group stay. The rest leave. Out of 10,000, he ends up, let's read. So Gideon took the men down to the water. There the Lord told him, separate those who lap water with their tongues as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink. 300 of them drank with cup hands, lapping like dogs. I got the dog part backwards. Lapping like dogs. All the rest got down on their knees to drink. And so he gets 300 guys. That's it. 300 guys. That's what Gideon has to work with. God says, okay, now you've got just the right number. In verse 7, the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand. Let all the others go home. So Gideon sent the rest of the Israelites home, but kept the 300 who took over the provisions and the trumpets of the others. Now that's important later, so remember that. But, Gideon stays. This is the amazing thing about this story to me, over and over again, is that when God calls Gideon, even through all these obstacles, he doesn't quit. I mean, I got to be honest, I might have been one of the 22,000 that left at the front end. But Gideon showed up and he hung in there repeatedly as God was taking him through all of these things, as did the 300 guys. There's a lot of things that happen, you want to figure out when you get to heaven. I want to meet these 300 guys and ask them, why didn't you leave when everybody else left? It's an amazing thing to me that they stayed against such an incredible army that they were fighting with. In verse 8, he said, keep their provisions and their trumpets. Here's a question that I had never thought of before, but I think is interesting, is who thought of the trumpet thing? I had always assumed that God gave Gideon the battle plan. You're going to do the thing with the trumpets and the torches. We're going to read about that in a minute. And, I thought, well, God gave him the instructions to do that. Kind of like marching around Jericho. I mean, when the Israelites took over Jericho, there was another crazy plan. But, God told them exactly what to do. He said, okay, you're going to march around the city. You're going to do that for 6 days, and then you're going to march around it 7 times, and you're all going to yell, and the walls are going to fall down. It wasn't a convincing plan, but it worked great because God is God. But God doesn't seem to tell Gideon to save the trumpets. I think that maybe that was Gideon's idea. I don't know. Maybe God told him, but I'm not sure who thought of it. Okay. Let's move on to this encouragement from the enemy thing. Pick up in verse 9. Now the camp of Midian lay below him in the valley. During the night, the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands." He keeps telling him this over and over again. "If you are afraid, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." So he and Purah, his servant, went down to the outposts of the camp. So God tells him to go down and listen in on the enemy. Now, this is funny to me because God says to him, "If you are afraid," here's a Bible study tip for you. Anytime the scriptures say if someone is afraid, it means they were afraid. That's why God doesn't waste words. And so he's very specific. He says, if you're afraid, go down and take your servant with you and listen in on what those guys are saying. And God then says, and you'll be encouraged by what you hear. In fact, you'll be ready to go after you listen to them. And so that's what they do. So let's read on a little bit. He says, in verse 12, the Midianites, Amalekites, and all the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. Gideon arrived just as a man was telling a friend his dream. "I had a dream," he was saying. "A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His friend responded, "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Okay. Now, I don't want anybody to answer out loud because, that would be embarrassing if the answer was yes. But, if you are thinking about yourself in your mind internally and you're trying to pump up your self-esteem, and trying to make yourself feel tough and strong and mighty. Do any of the guys in here ever visualize themselves as a round barley loaf? Probably not. That's my guess. Even though, that may be an apt description for some of us. But no, he says, of all the things that God picks to encourage him with, he says, this round barley loaf rolls into the camp and hits the tent. And the tent collapses, and the guys in the camp say, well, that's got to be Gideon, because God has given it into his hand. Here's the thing that is encouraging that we need to learn from. God works in the hearts of his people, but God works in hearts all over the world, not only in his followers. We want God to inspire us to go out and share our faith and help people become Christians. But here's the good news. God is preparing hearts for us to share with that we don't even know about. This kind of stuff happens all the time. In this case, he's preparing them for a particular circumstance here for this battle. But God is working in their heart even though they're not God's people. He's not limited to just working through his own people. Gideon gets the message in verse 15, we'll pick up. When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed down and worshiped. That's the appropriate response in this circumstance. He bowed down and worshiped. Then he returned to the camp and called out, "Get up, the Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." Dividing the 300 men into 3 companies, he placed trumpets and empty jars in the hands of all of them with torches inside. Gideon is no longer waffling. He's now bold. He's encouraged. He's ready to go. He goes back to the 300 guys and he says, "Get up. God's getting ready to do something, and we get to be a part of it." And so he gives them the plan, he gives them the trumpets, he gives them the torches, and there we go. Let's look at this idea of the spark becoming a fire. They get the 300 torches and the trumpets, and they go and they let's read what happens. It says in verse 19, Gideon and the 100 men with him reached the edge of the camp at the beginning of the middle watch, just after they had changed the guard. They blew the trumpets and broke the jars that were in their hands. The 3 companies blew the trumpets and smashed the jars, grasping the torches in their left hand and holding in their right hands the trumpets they were to blow. They shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." While each man held his position around the camp, all the Midianites ran, crying as they fled. Verse 22, when the 300 trumpets sounded, the Lord caused the men throughout the camp to turn on each other with their swords. The army fled to Bethshidah and toward Zareph, as far as the border of Abel Maleah near Tabbath. So this is what they do. They break their lamps, light their torches, and eventually they blow their trumpets. Now, this causes a panic in the armies of the eastern people, including the Midianites. Why does this cause a panic? Well, here's the thing. When you go out to battle, you don't go out to battle with every guy carrying a trumpet. That's not normal battle tactics. Anybody who's been in the armed services knows that you have a battle group, whatever size it might be. Maybe it's a platoon, maybe it's a battalion, whatever. But you have one guy that's the trumpeter or the bugle player. And the reason that the trumpet is there is so that you can signal your troops. You can offer commands that can be heard over the battlefield with the trumpet. But there's one trumpet for a large group of people. And there's all kinds of ideas that, the number that came up most often was 1,000. So they hear 300 trumpets, and they think that there's this huge army about to descend on them, and they just start killing whatever's around them, even though it's each other. Now, look, there's supernatural stuff going on here. I can't explain all of this. It doesn't make logical sense. But here's what I want you to get, is that God is doing something amazing with this plan that is not a great battle plan, but it works because God's involved. Not only do they start to kill each other, almost more importantly, they run. They don't all get killed right in that spot by the 300 men. I've read the story of Gideon a bunch of times, and I always thought that the 300 guys did all the work. That's not the case. The guys run after they turn on each other, and then the rest of the Israelites join in the battle. Look at verse 23. Israelites from Naphtali, Asher, and all Manasseh were called out, and they pursued the Midianites. Gideon sent messengers ahead throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." So after the army runs, all of the warriors from these other tribes come out to join the battle, including some that weren't even called originally. Ephraim wasn't listed among the original ones that were called out, but all of these guys come out to fight the battle. Probably some of the 22,000 that trembled with fear came out. Probably some of the 10,000 that bent down on their knees and drank water out of the stream came back. But regardless of whether those were there or not, a lot of warriors came out from all of these tribes to chase the Midianites. And so it was a larger group than just the 300. But the 300 were the spark that started the fire. And they stayed at the point of the battle throughout. Midian is completely defeated. We're not going to read all of that. You can read from verse 24 in chapter 7 all the way through the end of chapter 8, and you can see that story. But they're totally wiped out. They have a lot of casualties, and they go back to their own country. It's interesting in chapter 8, verse 22 and 23, after the battle is ended, the Israelites come to Gideon, and they say to Gideon, "Rule over us." Basically, they offer him to be a king. They say, rule over us, you and your son and your grandson. They want to set up a long-time, powerful leadership option for Gideon. Gideon refuses this. He says, I'm not going to rule over you, and my kids aren't going to rule over you. God is going to rule over you. That's his response. So what can we learn from this story? Well, a couple of these are left over from last week. One, God works through unexpected people. Amen. Gideon is not the guy you would have expected, as we talked about last week, but God did great things through him and through a small number of others. Victory comes from God even though he uses us. We talked about that last week, but sometimes we get confused. We think it's us doing the work. No, it's God that really does the work. God doesn't need large numbers to do his work. We always think we need to have a lot of folks. That's not necessarily the case. God can do great things with a relatively small number of people, and things will grow from there. This is something we've all lived through a lot of times. God often uses crazy plans. And we've had some around here, I can tell you that. And I've seen a lot of them in my lifetime. And sometimes the things that make the least, why would you give away socks? I'm still trying to figure, I'm not saying that God's going to save the world through socks. But when this idea came up, I said, wow, socks. Okay, that's what we're doing. God uses the craziest things to accomplish things. And that's good. That makes life fun. Actions that come from faith will inspire others. Your faith doesn't have to carry the whole load. Your faith will affect other people's faith, and before long you'll look around you and there will be an army of people that have faith that are doing God's work. That's the way it functions. So, the point is we need to act in faith so that we can inspire others around us. And lastly, we need to follow God, not people. A lot of times, like the Israelites, we want to put somebody forward as a leader and put our hope in people. We need to take the admonition that Gideon had when he was asked to be in that position and say, no, it's not about me, it's about God. God is the one who really leads, whether it's the church or in your life. God is the one that is sovereign, not us. And so those are lessons that we can learn from Gideon. I hope it's been helpful to you as we've looked at Gideon learning to trust God's call. All of us are called by God. Let's listen to him, have faith, and step out and take action on the call that God gives us, and we will see great things happen. Amen.